If you visited me in Brussels, I might meet you at the Starbucks at the North train station, which is near my house. Every day at this station, well, in normal times anyway, about 30,000 commuters pour out of the doors and into the glass-plated skyscrapers of Brussels' financial district. But you don't have to look far to find brokenness. Dozens of illegal migrants call a park in the middle of this district home. And sometimes on cold days, they escape to the inside of the station to warm up. The station itself shelters homeless people of various kinds, from drunken and bedraggled European men to Roma women sent out to beg. And then behind the station is the infamous Brussels red light district, with women in the windows for sale. At least one good thing about the COVID virus: most of the windows are empty right now. In other parts of our city, some of the needs hide and are less evident, but they're still there. If we thought of our city as a community garden, ours is dry, dusty, and full of weeds. It's neglected and abandoned. It needs clearing and hoeing and planting and watering. So what does your city look like? What do you see when you look out your windows? What do you observe when you go to neighborhoods that are not yours? What is the state of your community garden? The people of Israel were fasting for a day to see if they could get God to rain down his blessings on them, to make them a well-watered garden. But they were treating him like an idol that they could control. And at the same time, they were withholding blessing from the people around them, exploiting them and ignoring them, and in fact, actively contributing to the drying up of the garden of their community, all the while asking for God's blessing of prosperity in their own lives and to meet their own needs and their own desires. God asks them instead to participate in a new discipline, a new kind of fast, one that is not self-serving, one that is not just a pious gesture to seek blessing for themselves. Rather, he calls them to the discipline of blessing those around them, to pour themselves out on behalf of others whose need is greater than theirs. In Isaiah 58, 6-10, God says, "Is this not the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you, and the glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry, and he will say, Here I am. If you take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger and speaking wickedness, if you pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then shall your light rise in the darkness and your gloom be as the noonday." God calls this new discipline that he describes in this text a fast. As we've already heard, a fast at the time included abstaining from both food and water. It involved a lot of sacrifice, but it was also a spiritual discipline that was meant to lead the participant into the worship of God. In the same way, God calls his people here to a new discipline, a new fast, but this one of his own choosing. This time, it involved forgoing our own needs by prioritizing the needs of others, the very same people that they had previously been exploiting and overlooking as of little worth or relevance to their own lives. He reveals to his people a discipline that involves seeing those around them who are in need and bringing blessing to them. Instead of focusing on the blessings they want to get from God, they're being called to water and tend their community gardens by blessing the people who are within arm's length of them, people whose lives are dark and dry and broken. It involves sacrifice. In verse 10, he suggests that they pour themselves out on behalf of the hungry. So that involves more than just donating a few unwanted cans from your pantry. He talks about sharing your bread with the hungry and bringing the homeless poor into your house. This isn't just a matter of writing a check from afar. It involves relating to people, sitting down with them and sharing not only your resources, but your own life with them. Disciplines are not meant to be easy. That's why they're called disciplines. And yet, it's through the practice of this discipline with a heart of true worship and love for God that God assures them that they will experience the very discipline, the very blessing that they have been seeking. He says, "Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you, and the glory of your Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry, and he will say, 'Here I am.'" What will they get? Light that will give them revelation and guidance, healing from the ills that plague them, true righteousness rather than the hypocritical piety they had been practicing before, protection from God himself, and answers to their desperate prayers. And as they practice this discipline with a heart of worship, all those things will come quickly. The picture of light breaking forth like the dawn is that of an egg shattering all at once. The picture of healing springing up speedily is that of water gushing from a fountain in the ground. A well-watered garden indeed. But we will consider these blessings in good time. First, let's look more closely at the discipline of blessing that the Lord is calling us to, the fast that he has chosen for us to honor him with, and the community garden that he is sending us into to tend for him. The first group that God calls us to bless are people who are oppressed. Is this not the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? The word that's translated wickedness in the ESV here can also be translated as injustice. So here we see that the first part of the discipline of blessing involves reversing injustice in the lives of people who have been ill-treated or oppressed. All of the word pictures here have to do with physical freedom, loosing bonds or chains of someone who is bound and unable to get free by themselves, undoing the straps of a yoke that is burdening a person with a heavy load so that they can take it off, setting free people who are oppressed, an image of release from prison, and then actually chopping to bits a yoke that has been used to oppress someone so it can't be used anymore. This word oppressed here that's used can also mean bruised. And maybe it's helpful for us to think about this group of people in this way. Oppressed for us has maybe political connotations, and politics is one of the things that gets in the way of our openness to participating in God's discipline of blessing. But when we think of people who are bruised, on the other hand, perhaps our compassion can begin to stir. We can imagine what it might be like to be beaten by someone else, to be covered in bruises, perhaps to the point that it is difficult to move or speak freely. And maybe this can begin to motivate us to see those who are bruised around us. Another thing that often gets in our way of developing the discipline of blessing the oppressed is that we don't feel responsible for their bruises. We say, I wasn't the one who bruised them. I didn't oppress them. And perhaps we weren't. But by refusing to recognize these people or the bruises they've suffered, we are in fact perpetuating the abuse and allowing it to continue. And sometimes we even carry this collusion with oppression a step further. Notice verse 9b. Take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger and speaking wickedness. Now, the pointing of the finger speaks of a formal legal accusation of someone, condemning them for wrongdoing. We're commanded here not to contribute to injustice by speaking slander of people. In this context, slander of those who are already under the yoke of oppression. And pointing the finger also carries another, even more sinister connotation, that of speaking a curse on someone. So we may add to the injustice done to an already bruised person who is under oppression by pointing the finger and blaming them for the situation in which they find themselves. We can say, it's their own fault. Look at the things they've done, or look at the things they're doing that are wrong. And in this way, we excuse ourselves from having to face the bruises that this person is carrying. Another way that we can point the finger and add to oppression is by accusing them of somehow trying to take advantage of us and looking with suspicion upon them. We can focus on what we might lose if we were actually to act to set right the injustice done to them and to spend our resources on their behalf. When we point the finger at someone else, we put ourselves in the place of God, who is the only judge. We put ourselves in the judgment seat, deciding whose bruises are worth treating and whose bruises are their just deserts. We draw lines so that we will lose nothing. But if this is a fast, so what if we lose something? All we have is God's anyway. God is calling us to take away the yoke from our midst. We are to engage in the discipline of blessing so that injustice is erased from among us. We are to do what we are able to bring freedom and healing to the bruised. So, as we look around the city, who are some people we might see in this category? Who might we bless with justice and restoration? Well, one is people who've been abused, physically and emotionally. These could be battered women or foster children that the courts have taken from their parents, single parents who've been deserted by their partners. For these people, it's not so hard for us to sympathize with their bruises when they've suffered in this way. And we also know they're not that far away from us either. Another group, people who have been trafficked. Now, we often associate trafficking with prostitution, but there's many other kinds, into slave labor type jobs on construction sites, or as hotel cleaners, or as gang members forced to deal drugs. Now, we also sympathize with these people, but more often we feel like they're outside our reach. They're not. Your local nail salon may be importing women from Asia who are essentially slaves. Our beach communities and amusement parks hire foreign workers who are underpaid, overworked, and crammed into tiny apartments with too many others. You can bless these people. Another group, asylum seekers and refugees escaping persecution in their home country. Again, for most of us, we don't have so much trouble empathizing with them, but the fact that their oppression has taken place in another country can make us blind to the continuing difficulties that they face as they're here in a new place. You have access to these people right here as well. And then economic migrants. Now, this is where it gets more difficult, where we start to be blinded to the bruised by politics and by practicalities. But rather than pointing the finger at illegals, put yourself in their shoes. Imagine yourself in a situation where the circumstances of life, perhaps occasioned by a corrupt regime, puts you in a place where it is difficult even to provide for your family. Would you not wish to find a better place to live? Whatever policies are needed at the governmental level, don't lose sight of the bruises of these people, and especially not when you're face to face with them. And finally, people with a generational history of abuse and oppression. I grew up in Australia where my parents were missionaries with the Noongar tribe of Aboriginal people. And we saw firsthand how they were treated in a country that, when we arrived there, still had a white Australia policy. One of the protocols of this policy is that half-caste girls with light skin were taken away from their black mothers and they raised them in group homes as white. Then after they graduated, they became domestic servants in the homes of the rich. There's a 2002 film called Rabbit Proof Fence that's all about this. And in fact, my parents worked with girls who had been in the home that was featured in this film. Even the elderly missionary we worked with patronized the Noongars, treating them like children and telling them, "I know you better than you know yourselves." So as missionaries among these people, my parents needed to learn what was it like for Noongars to live in a white Australia. And even though the white Australia policy was abolished nearly 50 years ago now, the scars and bruises of this still remain in Aboriginal communities. Here in America, it's not hard to see the bruises that are left by a generational history of abuse among American Indians and African Americans. Now, because of the way this issue has been used in politics, many of us just want to steer clear and maybe even stop up our ears when it comes to this. But God calls us to take away the yoke from our midst. And this means that we must examine both ourselves and the historical legacy of our community with the clarity of the light God will give. After all, we live in the place where the very first African slaves set foot on American soil 400 years ago. And we are just down the road from where white folks from Pocosin would shoot black folks who entered the community not so long ago. We need to realize this leaves scars. even if we feel that we ourselves are not prejudiced, or perhaps even especially if we feel ourselves to be pure of prejudice, we need to lean into understanding the bruises that our neighbors have suffered. We need to learn how to be humble and to step into the healing of racial reconciliation. Our friends Cindy Hahn and Sue Grimes can help us think through this in their breakout session later. So how can we cultivate a community garden of freedom? How can we bring blessing to the bruised? Well, it starts with seeing these people. First, just noticing and acknowledging them being there, not overlooking or ignoring them. And then it means having the humility to see them as people like us, putting ourselves in their shoes, feeling what they feel. It means letting God shine his light into the dark corners of their experience and of our prejudices. When we embrace the discipline of blessing people who are oppressed, the first step is to bring the light of hope into the world of people who've been bruised. It starts with our approach to them, not with a victim mentality, but with a hope mentality that sees a time when freedom is complete. We bless people by painting hope pictures, not just in speeches like Martin Luther King's, but by doing things that demonstrate what it is we hope for. The next step is to sprinkle the water of healing into our community gardens, to connect with people as people in conversation and relationship, rather than simply as an issue. In Serve the City, we like to say, we know them by their needs. What if we knew them by name? For the bruised, the first step is to listen and understand their name and their story. Then the third step is to replant and rebuild. This starts with reconciliation between me and them, between my people and theirs on a personal level. But by taking small steps, you may find that you begin to rebuild broken systems on a larger scale as well. When I think of someone who's loosing the bonds of injustice and undoing the straps of the yoke, I think of my husband, Carlton. He was concerned about the dozens of migrants from Northeast Africa who were living in that park next to the train station. Their goal was somehow to sneak on a truck or a train or a boat to the UK, and while there, earn money to send back to their families. But because these people are illegal migrants, they have no rights in Belgium to access facilities like homeless shelters or asylum centers or soup kitchen. And a few years back, as the weather got colder, Carlton gathered some friends to come to the park early on a few mornings a week to serve coffee and sandwiches to these guys. They had spent their nights either trying to cross the channel or trying to sleep outdoors in the park. Either way, they were cold and they were hungry. But Carlton felt like they needed to be seen and acknowledged as human beings regardless of their legal status. So they'd come and they'd get some coffee and they'd chat with the volunteers in whatever common languages they had. And eventually, as this went on, Serve the City Brussels, together with some other charities, ended up setting up a winter shelter for these people. Not because they deserved it legally, but to preserve their lives. Medical teams ministered to their health problems, and legal advisors helped to direct them to better futures. Some were encouraged to return home, and others who had suffered persecution of some kind were helped to apply for asylum in Belgium. But it all started with a cup of coffee. These were bruised people who had endured danger and loss to come to this place. We could take the time to offer them a coffee, to hear their stories and their names, and to understand just a little of what it was that was driving them. It wasn't a political act for Carlton to minister to these people, but a discipline of blessing, of passing on the Lord's kindness that we had received to people who bear his image. The second group God calls us to bless are people in need. Is God's fast not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him and not to hide from your own flesh? This group of people in need is perhaps easier for us to see, and we might be able to name more of them in our own community. Here are a few. Families and or children living in poverty. All you need to do is drive through some of the streets of downtown Newport News or Hampton to see some of these neighborhoods where people live. Another is homeless people We might encounter these people standing on a street corner, or perhaps if we venture into a shelter that serves them. Some, however, especially women and children, may be more hidden from us because they're living in their cars or drifting from house to house, living with friends and acquaintances, or maybe eking out money to pay week by week for a cheap hotel room. Another group in need are disabled people and people with chronic illness. This also includes people with mental disabilities and illness, and we should also remember the families of those who are caring for the disabled people. Unwed or single mothers. It's a struggle for women who finds herself alone and pregnant, or has been left to raise a family single-handed. This struggle is often not only financial, but also emotional and psychological. Elderly people. It takes little imagination to picture the difficulty of gradually losing your physical and mental faculties and the frustration and isolation that results from that. Now, thinking of these people, we're aware of these needs in these groups, but sometimes we can be stingy about sharing our resources to meet them, much like Ebenezer Scrooge.
At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and the destitute. Many thousands are in want of common comfort, sir.
Are there no prisons?
Prisons? Yes, plenty of prisons.
And the union workhouses, are they still in operation?
They are. I wish I could say they were not.
The treadmill in full vigor?
Very busy, sir.
Good. I was afraid something had occurred to stop them in their useful course.
Yes, at this festive season, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. What shall we put you down for?
Nothing.
Oh, you wish to remain anonymous?
I wish to be left alone. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I support the establishments I have mentioned, and those who are badly off must go there.
Many cannot go there, and, well, frankly, many would rather die.
Then they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
We might find Scrooge's callousness particularly shocking, but it's not really hard for us to similarly outsource the needs of the needy to someone else. It's easy for us to say, but they have people for that. So it becomes the responsibility of homes or of charities or the government to care for the needs of the needy, not mine. But God states here in no uncertain terms that he wants you to embrace the discipline of blessing people who are needy. He says, pour yourself out for the hungry, satisfy the desire of the afflicted. And as we mentioned earlier, this discipline of blessing the needy involves sacrifice. We share our own food. We invite the homeless into our houses. We pour ourselves out, or as the NIV says, we spend ourselves on behalf of the needs of people who are in want. This word that's translated desire here in the ESV is an interesting one. It's a common Hebrew noun, nephesh, and the literal meaning of it is a breathing creature, though it's translated in various figurative ways throughout Scripture, such as soul, life, body, heart, and so on. In the NIV, however, it's translated as needs. Now, I find it deeply interesting to think about needs as an integral part of a breathing creature. God has made us needy, all of us. In verse 11, our theme verse, the same word is used of those who have been seeking God's blessing. He says, "The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land." So we too are needy, and this should humble us as we approach those with more basic and apparent needs than as our own. As we acknowledge the creatureliness of those around us and become God's instrument to minister to their needs, God will also minister to ours. But in order to enact this discipline of blessing, we must first see the needy. We must not hide ourselves from them. We can hide ourselves by never venturing into parts of the city where we encounter need, but we can also do this by just ignoring the ones who are right in front of our faces. Some of the needy that we ignore, verse 7 reminds us, are our own flesh and blood. They're members of our own family, or they're members of our own church, our brothers and sisters in Christ. The book of James reminds us that the discipline of blessing is always practical, not just pious. He says, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? And so, as with blessing the oppressed, we must bless people in need also with action as we cultivate our community garden. So once more, the first step is to bring the light of hope. This is done through small practical actions that meet people's real and immediate needs. We might feel like giving someone a sandwich or a box of food is a small thing, and it's not really going to make a big difference to the larger problem. But that small thing is a spark of hope. And as we always say in Serve the City, many people doing small things together can make a big difference. The second step is to pour out the water of healing as you connect with these people, not in just practical, but also personal ways. If we just keep giving emergency aid without developing healing relationships, we create stunted dependency. Our goal is not to fix people, but through supportive relationships to allow them to discover the best ways to move from neediness to generosity themselves. And the third step of replanting and restoring your community garden comes as you're able to impact the broken systems that you personally have access to. This might be through a school or an elderly home or a homeless mission or even local government. Doing this will change the lives of many as you touch with blessing the systems that are there within your reach. When I think of someone who has modeled this kind of sacrificial blessing to the needy, I think of my parents. In our first years in Australia, their salary was set so low that we qualified for social housing in a housing project in the city. And yet, we were constantly welcoming people into our home for conversations over tea, for meals made out of the cheap food that my parents could afford. We always brought home people for Christmas dinner who had nowhere else to go, people who'd come to our Christmas morning service. We also hosted quite a lot of people in our home overnight, some of them for days or weeks at a time. Many of our overnight visitors were Aboriginal people that we knew from the countryside who stayed with us while they were looking for a job in the city. And others were missionaries who had just arrived in the area and were finding their feet, or seminary students from the U.S. doing an internship overseas. I also remember my parents housing an unwed mother who had been kicked out of her house during her pregnancy while I was in college. Another time, they sent me and my sister to sleep at friends' houses when they found out that the homeless man they had invited over for dinner and to stay overnight had just been let out of prison for rape. And then, not to forget our own flesh and blood, my autistic uncle lived with us for a year after my grandmother became ill and had to go to a nursing home. So do I feel deprived because of this upbringing? No, I feel blessed beyond measure. God always supplied our family's needs through the generous gifts of our supporters. And I loved, even as a kid, meeting all these different people as they came to our home. Okay, some of them were challenging for sure, but it was always an adventure. And when we embrace the discipline of blessing the bruised and the needy, God is with us. And it can even be fun. Isaiah is not the only prophet by any means who encourages us to this discipline of blessing the oppressed and the needy. Micah 6:8 tells us also that this is God's requirement. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? Look at those two first requirements. Do justice. This is the same as taking away the yoke from your midst. Love kindness. This is pouring yourselves out for the needy. And as we do all that, we do it in the presence of God as an act of humble worship to the one who is using our discipline of blessing to bless not only the bruised and needy, but us as well. When Jesus tells the story of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, it's not a parable, it's a prophecy. His story would have reminded the disciples of Isaiah 58, with its context of judgment and reward, and also the people that he mentions, the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the stranger, the sick, the prisoner. They all have clear parallels with this text. But in this text, Jesus takes this discipline of blessing even farther than Isaiah does, in two ways. The first, and the most surprising to those being judged in Matthew 25, is that Jesus identifies himself with the oppressed and needy. I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was a stranger. The king himself comes down in humility and takes on the distressing disguise of the poor and lowly among the people. Neither the sheep nor the goats realized that the prisoner or the sick person they had ministered to or neglected was Jesus, incognito. And the second surprise, resulting from Jesus' identification with the needy, is that Jesus accepts what is done for the least of these to him as worship. The discipline of blessing is not about handing out alms and hoping people will notice, like the Israelites with their hypocritical fast. It's about seeing Jesus in the face of the one in need and relating to him or her as if our King sat in front of us. It's about pouring ourselves out for love of Jesus by loving the least of these. No wonder we are immediate recipients of blessing. No matter how the person we actually serve receives us, even if they're ungrateful or manipulative or hostile, Jesus receives our serving as blessing to him. It's a direct line between our heart and his. It can give us great joy in doing the smallest and humblest of tasks, even those that seem a bit futile. But in order to experience this blessing, we must first unbind our eyes. We must put on Jesus glasses to see the people around us, to discover him in his distressing disguise. We must seek him out in our homes and our families. We must look for him in our church. We must roam the streets of our city with our cars. We must enter schools and shelters and prisons, and Jesus will meet us there. He will look in our eyes and tell the story of his story of life in our city. And then we can act. We can bring the light of hope. We can bring the water of healing. We can replant and rebuild our neglected community gardens and discover that as we do, Jesus is bringing hope and healing and renewal to us as well as we enter this most intimate act of worship to him.